They woke to stillness, the kind that made even the heart hesitate. For years, each dawn had been a summons, commands, clanging metal, barking dogs cutting through the cold. But this morning, nothing. Only the slow stretch of wind moving through the Oklahoma plains, a low whisper against canvas tents. Inside the barracks, the smell of dust and soap lingered. Men stirred from bunks, half expecting the usual orders. Some reached for boots polished out of habit, others for caps that no longer signified command. The war had ended days earlier, yet no one dared speak of freedom. It sounded too much like rumor. Then the door creaked open, and an American lieutenant stepped in, young, freckled, clipboard in hand. He glanced around at faces carved by fatigue and disbelief. "Pack your things, gentlemen," he said, voice almost casual. "You're going home." For a suspended heartbeat, the air refused to move. General Hans Kremser rose slowly, unsure whether he had understood. His English was fluent, but the words made no sense. "You're going home." No interrogation, no tribunal? Surely not yet. The lieutenant smiled faintly. "Trains leave after noon meal. You're free men now." The announcement rippled outward. Boots scuffed on wooden floors. Someone laughed briefly, then stopped, embarrassed by the sound. Others murmured prayers, names, fragments of disbelief in a dozen dialects. Outside, sunlight blazed across the camp's wire fences. Dust swirled through open gates that, for the first time, would not swing shut at dusk. The horizon stretched unbroken so wide it felt almost indecent after years of confinement. Within a few hours, columns of former enemies stood neatly at the loading platform, uniforms washed and mended, kit bags slung over tired shoulders. Each man carried more questions than belongings. They had braced for judgment, maybe decades behind the wire, laboring to rebuild what their bombs had destroyed. Instead, their conquerors were sending them home with packed lunches, new shoes, even a handful of rations for their families. From the tower, guards waved. A sergeant shouted something, cheerful words lost under the hiss of steam. Cameras clicked. A U.S. Army journalist captured the strange symmetry, the defeated marching freely, the victorious standing still. As the train lurched, Kremser looked out the narrow window at fields shimmering under prairie sun. Behind those fences lay the months when mercy had disguised itself as routine, the rations, the fair treatment, the quiet dignity that had softened his certainty about everything he thought he knew. America's generosity defied logic, yet it felt implacable, deliberate, as if freedom itself had decided to make its final argument by letting its enemies walk away. They had prepared for punishment. Instead, they were being taught trust. The whistle shrieked again, a sound both ending and beginning. Across the American heartland in 1945, victory filled the air like the scent of wheat after rain. Rows of white tents and wooden barracks dotted the landscape from Texas to the Dakota's temporary cities fenced with barbed wire, guarded by boys barely old enough to shave. Inside those fences were men whose uniforms carried an empire's last gasps, field gray, frayed at the cuffs, stitched with vanished authority. The United States held more than 400,000 German prisoners by war's end. They arrived on converted cargo ships from North Africa, France, and Italy, long days and nights at sea, followed by the bewildering sight of a continent untouched by war. The captured officers expected anger when they landed. Instead, they found clean camps, hot meals, orderly registration, and guards who often greeted them with polite curiosity rather than scorn. To the prisoners, America seemed impossible. Its grocery shelves groaned under abundance. Cars clogged small-town streets while Europe starved. The radio spoke of dances, advertisements, baseball scores, soap operas, normal life, as if the apocalypse hadn't just occurred overseas. Many of the captured generals had studied history. They remembered what happened to prisoners in earlier wars, how humiliation festered, how revenge smoldered for generations. Yet the Americans, industrious and direct, followed a different doctrine, strict rules, unflinching courtesy, unembellished fairness. Camps even hosted lectures about democracy and civic life, conducted by professors whom Washington dispatched like missionaries of moderation. It was less re-education than exposure. Guards discussed politics freely in front of their captives. Newspapers critical of their own government circulated within the wire. The Germans found this openness unnerving, almost reckless. In their world, freedom was fragile, something protected by censorship and hierarchy. Here it was routine, spoken aloud without fear. General Kremser, formerly of the 10th Army, began chronicling these contradictions in a weathered notebook. He scribbled lines in German and English. Their discipline is without fear. Power is not loved, yet it works. He learned that the men guarding him earned only slightly more than he had as a young officer, yet they drove their own trucks, owned homes, and argued with superiors as equals. Liberty, he realized, was not disorder, it was confidence. Beyond the fences, the war's emotional gravity was shifting. American families sent Christmas cards to local camps, sometimes pies or spare books. Newspapers published photographs of German POWs decorating trees, working on farms, repairing fences alongside civilians. As Europe remained a wasteland, these images astonished the world, the victors extending comfort instead of cruelty. What started as pragmatic adherence to the Geneva Convention grew into something rarer, a moral experiment in restraint. By early 1946, that experiment demanded an answer. With Germany defeated and peace secured, what should be done with hundreds of thousands of men once sworn to Hitler's command? The question divided generals and senators alike. Britain and France argued for long internments to rebuild what the Nazis had destroyed. The Soviet Union demanded forced labor. But America, safe, wealthy, untouched by rubble, heard another voice inside its conscience. It asked, what do we prove by keeping them? The administration's answer would soon travel by train and telegram. The gates would open, and the defeated would go home. Orders arrived on a humid July morning, typed pages, stamped in blue ink, neatly signed, and almost unbelievable. The directive was blunt: begin phased repatriation of all German prisoners within the year. In every camp, the rumor spread faster than radio waves. Men passed the news in whispers, across bunks, between work details, through the kitchen lines. Some cheered, others who'd learned to distrust good fortune called it propaganda. After years of expecting punishment, how could release come so quickly and without condition? At Camp McCain in Mississippi, General Kremser read the bulletin aloud to his fellow officers. Laughter burst from one corner, disbelief from another. "They mean to send us back already?" asked an old artillery commander whose uniform still bore invisible medals. To what? Ashes and ruins? Nobody answered. For whichever side of the war you stood on, home was no longer what you remembered. When trucks rolled in bearing crates of Red Cross parcels, soap, fresh shirts, and travel papers, the disbelief deepened. Lists were pinned to bulletin boards, names of men who would leave within days. The camp's gates, those familiar lines of steel and shadow, suddenly felt less like boundaries and more like a threshold the world was daring them to cross. They watched the guards for signs of mockery, testing every kindness for hidden motive. But the Americans simply carried on, efficient and calm. "You fought well," one sergeant told them. "Now go fix what's left." The first departures looked like parades rehearsed by disbelief. Columns of officers marched not under captivity's glare, but to the slow applause of townspeople who had gathered nearby out of curiosity, their children waving small flags. Some locals had grown friendly with the prisoners through farm work, trading music and language lessons. The farewells were earnest, awkward, profoundly human. Newspapers from Oklahoma to Georgia published photographs of smiling guards shaking hands with men who had worn the double lightning bolts, the oak leaves, the Iron Cross. The editorial columns called it the American way of peace. Letters to editors were less certain. Should we reward them so soon? Some asked. Let kindness wait until justice is done. But Washington had its reasons. Feeding and guarding so many men was expensive. More importantly, America wanted the moral contrast to echo eastward proof to a divided world that democracy could afford mercy where dictatorships demanded vengeance. Still, for the officers awaiting departure, gratitude felt perilous. How does one thank a conqueror without shame? In the last week before the trains left, Kremser found himself wandering the camp perimeter at dusk. Behind him, other prisoners packed quietly, folding uniforms, binding small gifts for their American hosts, hand-carved boxes, sketches of the plains, tiny flags made from scrap cloth. Across the fence, guards smoked and talked about baseball. One of them, Corporal Jim Hutchins from Kansas, called out, "Bet you're glad to see the back of us, eh, General?" Kremser hesitated, then answered honestly, "I'm not sure I am." Hutchins laughed, and the sound had none of the bitterness war once required. "You'll do fine, sir. You Germans always land on your feet." But that night Kremser wrote in his notebook, "They treat us as people. It makes remembering what we did harder." By September, repatriation had become an unstoppable rhythm. Camps emptied into railway yards. Locomotives groaned under the weight of men and their unease. On each platform, guards handed out ration bags and stamped papers, then saluted not mockingly, but as equals temporarily separated by history. When one hesitant prisoner apologized for having no money to buy gifts in return, a supply officer pressed a packet of chocolate into his hand. "For the kids back home," he said, "tell them Americans aren't monsters." In that gesture lay the quiet victory of the age, yet for many, freedom carried its own pain. Standing on the decks of ships bound for Bremen and Hamburg, watching the sun diminish in the west, they felt a new burden rising, to justify mercy, to walk back into a broken world and rebuild it worthy of such release. One diary found years later captured it in a single exhausted line. How do you repay kindness that you once swore could not exist? They arrived back to a country they could barely recognize. The cranes at Bremen port stood twisted and skeletal. The air smelled of wet ash and diesel. Roads were so pocked with bomb craters that the trucks carrying them inland moved slower than a man could walk. Between the ruins, people stared at them, not with celebration, not even resentment, but numb curiosity. The uniform still marked them as soldiers, but the world no longer wanted soldiers. They had returned to the funeral of the Germany they'd pledged to defend. For General Kremser, the disorientation was indescribable. Months before, he had been a prisoner of men he expected to hate. Now, stepping through the debris of Hanover's collapsed rail yard, he found himself missing the calm discipline of American order, the predictability, the decency. Freedom here felt brittle, uncertain, almost abstract. Yet within that chaos began the revelation. He met a boy about 12, barefoot, selling newspapers printed on gray recycled stock. The headline read, "Captives Return America Redeems Its Word." The boy asked if it was true. Kremser nodded. "They let us go home." The boy frowned. "Why?" Kremser hesitated, then answered, "Because they could." That explanation lingered in him for years. Freedom, he realized, was not instinct. It was choice repeated until it became character. The Americans had chosen. Now it was his turn. In the weeks that followed, reports flowed from every corner of the shattered nation. Former POWs opening soup kitchens with canned food they'd brought from the States, repairing roads using the tools they'd handled in American camps, teaching villagers English phrases like "thank you" and "fair share." Many officers wrote letters to their former guards. Some reached Kansas, Texas, Georgia, lined paper full of careful handwriting, you treated us as men. We will remember." Slowly, a strange alignment took shape between the lessons learned behind barbed wire and the miracle of the Marshall Plan taking form in Washington. America wasn't abandoning its former enemies. It was betting that mercy, if practiced long enough, could outlive ideology. By 1948, as new constitutions took root in Bonn, journalists noted a curious statistic. Many of the administrators staffing West Germany's offices were ex-prisoners of the United States. When asked why they now served democracy with such zeal, they often replied the same way: "We saw it work." For Kremser, the transformation settled quietly. He kept his American pass card folded in his wallet until the day he died, a faded rectangle of paper stamped "Released U.S. Forces." Each time he looked at it, he thought of those fences opening, the trains rolling east, the soft voice of the lieutenant saying, "You're free to go." He understood something that philosophy had never taught him, that mercy is not pity. Mercy is confidence. It is the act of choosing kindness because one believes truth will survive it. And that realization moved like current through an entire generation that had stared at defeat and found grace instead. When Kremser was invited to America years later for a veterans reunion, he stood under a flag that once represented his enemy and whispered to a young soldier beside him, "We lost the war. They won the peace." The camera would linger here, light washing over both flag stars and stripes rippling beside the new tricolor of West Germany, as if history had paused long enough to forgive itself. History rarely ends with gunfire. It ends in the quiet that follows the hum of trains, the clatter of rebuilding, the small reconciliations that keep memory from hardening into hate. America's decision to free its prisoners so quickly became one of those quiet endings. It slipped past headlines but settled deep in human memory, an act that redefined what victory meant. Across the Atlantic, in the dark basements of ruined cities, whispers of that mercy traveled faster than bread lines. People spoke of the enemy who fed, not starved, who released, not exploited. For the American soldiers who guarded the camps, it had felt natural, almost ordinary. They followed regulations, treated captives fairly, and when peace was signed, they let the fences open. But in that ordinariness lay a moral revolution. The United States had chosen not to imitate the cruelty it had defeated. It proved the point that no propaganda ever could. Real strength doesn't need to humiliate. For the Germans who returned home, the realization grew with time. They had expected hatred to mirror hatred. Instead, they were handed responsibility. By being trusted, they learned to trust. That subtle inversion became a cornerstone of West Germany's rebirth. Democracy was no longer an imported slogan. It was a practiced habit learned in fields of cotton and wheat under American skies. Global historians would later see the gesture as a pivot in Western civilization's story, the moment the victors of the bloodiest war in human history refused to drink the same bitterness that had poisoned Europe for generations. From that refusal came stability, and from stability, a fragile understanding that mercy can be a weapon of peace. General Kremser lived long enough to see it. In his later years, he wrote a short memoir not about battles or tactics, but about a single morning, the lieutenant's voice saying, "You're going home." His final entry reads, "They taught us what a free country feels like. We must keep deserving that memory." That sentiment outlived him. It traveled through classrooms, alliances, and ordinary friendship between once opposed peoples. In time, the camps disappeared, their coordinates erased by suburbs and farmland. Yet every so often, a farmer plowing deep soil still uncovers a relic, a spoon, a dog tag, a scrap of uniform button, and wonders about the hands that dropped it. Those traces are small reminders that history's sharpest edges are often softened not by treaties, but by mercy. What remains remarkable is not that so many prisoners went home, but that they went home changed. They carried back the simple, radical idea that goodness need not be reciprocated to be true. For a world staggering out of darkness, that idea was the first real light. The camps have vanished, swallowed by fields and highways, but the echo of their gates opening still hums through the century. In those fleeting months, America discovered that freedom's surest proof is what it offers its enemies when the fighting stops. And the men who once saluted under the wrong flag carried that lesson home, stitching mercy into the fabric of their country's second birth. In a world that had nearly drowned in vengeance, the United States chose restraint. It won not only the war, but the right to believe that kindness itself could stand guard over peace.